Hello and welcome back to another Craig and Dave Unscripted. So we're back for another in our series of videos showcasing Mission Encodeable and what they do. If you've been following along, you'll know we're on to level 5. So let me bring them on straight away. As Harry and Anna, hello both of you. And level 5. So learn how to use the structured list data type in your programs. As I say, if you're new to these videos, just go back and have a look and you'll find out who these wonderful entrepreneurial young people are and what this series is about. But we're going to dive straight in. I'm going to hand over to Anna to talk us through Mission Encodeable level 5.
Yeah, so in level 5, we look at lists and we really just do lists. And that's kind of all we do in this level, but we do them really thoroughly. So we start off with kind of creating lists. We look at indexing lists, selecting items from lists, and then we go on to adding things to lists, removing things to lists, modifying them in all kinds of ways, copying them as well, because that's not how you might think it's done in Python. It's a bit different. Caught me and Harry out once or twice before, and also checking if something's in a list. So really deep dive into all things lists. So you or your students will become really confident in using them. And that means also, I think, Harry, I hope you agree that we can start making some more really fun projects. We actually have an 80s game show going on at one point, Play Your Cards Right. And I think the projects really do pick up a bit. They become more fun, like Shakespearean insults. Harry will talk a bit more about that later. And I think that's all I have to say, and I will hand over to Harry.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. Yeah, I think in level 5, again, I mean, I know we've probably said this in most of the videos so far, but the levels, as they progress, the projects do get more interesting. I think that's just generally how it's going to work. And this leads really nicely on actually to the next level, which is 6, where we begin to look at for loops. So make sure you stay tuned for that one. But yeah, here you can see on screen, I've got the capstone project, which is the constant bucket list. And essentially the idea behind this project is that we consolidate all that list knowledge into one. And here what we're doing is we've got a list that will keep track of which constants the users traveled to and which ones they might need to go to next. So I think we're probably all, well, I know we're all in Europe right now, so I can definitely add that one on if it will let me. And I can basically keep on adding them until I've finished. I've not been to a great deal of continents, but you might have been. But I'm going to pretend that I visited Asia before because it always looks like a very nice place. And I'm going to add, I'm assuming the 2 Americas will be separate, won't they? So I'll go.
Oh, here we go.
North,
your geography teacher at GCSE will be going, what?
And I can now press F, finish. And hopefully it will tell me which ones I still need to visit. Yeah, great. Geography GCSE students be very pleased, I'm sure, to know those are 2 separate continents. And those are the ones I've got left to visit. So that's the final project. And now I'll just show you inside the level at what steps we'll be doing. And as Anna was saying, we do go really thoroughly in depth to lists in this level. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that you need to learn to do with lists, how you can modify them, how you can shuffle them. And I think, you know, without these projects, that would be really quite dull to just read that tutorial and that one. And it's all important stuff, but really to understand why you're learning it, you need to see it in action with these projects. And we've got several of them throughout the level. So we start off, first project is the fake newspaper headline generator, or the silly newspaper headline generator, I think we call it sometimes. And it basically uses lists, and it will take out a word from each of these lists and essentially just smush them together in a really silly format. So you'll see it will make these kinds of phrases like, you know, elderly lady flies kite in swimming pool, or fish is amused to find elephant in playground. Obviously, those would never happen, but I suppose then again, if you read certain newspapers, you'll probably find things that would never happen. So it's kind of the idea behind this project. And I think they're really interesting. And perhaps if you work at one of those companies where you produce some very clickbaity articles, this project could actually help you out. So that's the first project. And we have quite a few more like that. So straight after, we've got the Shakespearean insults. I shan't say any of those, but if you would like to come up with some really good barbs to roast your friends with, then I'm sure this will come much to the rescue.
Sorry
will
to interrupt a
appreciate.
second. This is a great example. I've said it before, Dave. This is a great example of where we provide a lot of exercises in Time to Code, which are similar to the sort of things you'll see in the exam. But hands up, we know they're not the most fun activity to do. I mean, I'm laughing away at these two already, looking at some of the things that can come up. Of course, you're learning the same skills, and that's what makes this partnership so great, isn't it? You've got the freedom to make these fun projects, but the underlying skills are still the same.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm just looking at a few of these words now, and I'm not sure that I know what all of them mean, but I think we can definitely also appreciate some literature in this project. Perhaps English teachers would disagree with some of these appearing in Shakespearean texts, but I'm pretty sure that all of them did. I'm assuming, Anna.
I'm assuming so.
I think they all did. I'm not sure quite where Shakespeare used some of these words, but I'm sure if you looked through the complete works, you'd find them. But anyway, back onto the lists, and then we go on to sort and reverse lists before we look at race times. So that's a project, I guess, perhaps not as fun, debatably, as the Shakespearean insults, although it's still quite interesting. And I think it's where we can look at how this might be useful in the real world. So we can just order the times that were recorded in a race. So perhaps at Parkrun they could use this, or somewhere similar. So that's a really interesting one, and actually involves, I think, a few skills like the while loops, building on what we've done in the previous levels. And this is probably the best project in the whole level, I would say. It's Play Your Cards Right. So I think that's from an 80s game show that Anna and I were not around to watch, certainly.
I was. I remember.
But we've heard about it, and we quite like the idea of this game. So we've tried to recreate it in Python. I'll be honest and say I've not watched any of this game show, so I'll just hope that the project is an accurate enough simulation not to leave teachers screaming at me for, misrepresenting it. But even if it's not quite the same as the version they played, it's actually a really good game, and I think students will enjoy challenging each other to this. And just getting involved with the coding through making something really fun. Now we're getting towards the end of the stuff that's in this level now. So we look at copying lists. As Anna said, it's a bit different to how you might expect to do it, but you definitely want to make sure you're using the actual correct method, because otherwise you're going to be in a bit of a mess and you probably will get really confused as to why it's not working. I just know from experience that Anna and I have had this before. So definitely want to make sure you're doing it properly.
If you'll excuse the interruption here, Harry, I'm really interested in what it was that you discovered that Python does when you try and assign a variable to be a list that already exists. In other words, you've got a list defined as A, okay, and then you say B equals A, and everywhere else in programming, B becomes a copy of A, right? And you can do whatever you like with B after that without affecting A. What did you discover?
Well, I'll try and articulate it as best I can, but essentially you end up modifying the original list. So I'm trying to remember which way round you have the two letters, but I think one of them essentially becomes a pointer to the other. So it can be really quite frustrating, because if you had this trees list, for example, and you made a copy of that just by saying, copy of trees equals trees, if you then went on to modify that copy of trees, you'd actually be meddling about with the original trees list as well, which is really strange, I think, as a quirk of Python, although it's definitely worth reading through all these steps. And I think this is an example of why.
It's interesting because it's one of those things it's one of those things that at GCSE you don't appreciate what's happening. And when you get to A level, that gets demystified, because you learn the difference between a value and a reference. And you appreciate that when you say A equals B, and A and B are both integers, let's say, then you are effectively passing the value of A into B. Whereas when you do it with lists, what you're doing is something called passing by reference. And so, as you correctly say, B becomes a pointer to A, or in other words, B becomes the memory address of A. So you don't have two copies, you don't have two different locations in memory. as you might expect with ordinary variables, they actually end up pointing to the same memory location. So if you want to do a proper copy in Python, you need to have the value rather than the reference, and that's why you have to have this copy method to do that. So it's really interesting, just understanding that again. And this is where, you know, as teachers, we understand that already. So we kind of don't really think about it too much. And then you stumble across this as GCSE students, and suddenly everything that you thought you knew no longer makes any sense. It's like, there must be a bug in Python. This isn't working correctly. That's quite interesting. I think so anyway.
I know, I think it is quite an interesting one. And it's, you know, I mean, it's an example of where we've kind of discovered something as we were writing the tutorials, but we put all our learnings into this. So we'll keep on updating it as well. So if anyone spots anything that's awry, then let us know about it and we'll get on it. But that is pretty much all of the level that we've got to cover. So the next and final step is how we can check if something is in a list. That's really nice. And then we go on to the capstone project. So as ever, that's for you to attempt on your own. It's the one that I showed you at the start of the level. And hopefully by having practiced all of this stuff up here, by the time you get to this, you'll be, I think, a list legend, as we described it in a previous video we made somewhere. And you'll be prepared to take that on, hopefully manage to try and extend it on your own as well and add some more things to it. And then you'll be ready to claim a certificate at the end of the level. So that is level 5. We hope that you like it. And is there anything else that you'd like to add, Anna?
No, I think that was great.
I've got one observation and one sort of maybe question, Dave, you might like to discuss. I don't know. The observation, first of all, as everyone knows, that Craig and Dave very much takes responsibility for all the programming side of stuff. So you've been working very closely with Harry and Anna to come up with these levels and make sure they're in sync with our levels. So the observation, really, and comment on it if you wish, is I really like the fact you've decided there's an entire level specifically for lists. And you hinted at that at the start. You know, we want to get you really into this, and unless you know it properly, inserting into it, copying, doing stuff with it, starting with predefined lists, blank lists. You know, I love the fact there's a whole level devoted straight to it. And the other part of that is, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything for those people. We're assuming here, obviously, we're doing Python. A lot of people not doing Python might be slightly confused what lists are. They might think it's arrays. I know at some points we just turn around at a simplistic level and say, well, arrays and lists are essentially the same thing. And whether there's any sort of comment, I know exactly. This is why I thought you might like to just throw in a little bit of something there.
Yeah, okay. Make sure I don't talk for too long on this subject.
Yeah.
So the first observation about the sequencing of learning, absolutely. We recognized that a lot of examination questions require the understanding of lists. And when we reflected on the schemes of learning, we realized that lists were being taught towards the end of the scheme because they were perceived as more difficult than just working with variables and different types of iterations and whatnot. And we thought, well, that's not right, because if students need to really understand lists in order to access those questions, then we need to teach it much earlier. And actually, it's not a difficult concept. What makes it difficult is that you don't do it early enough. And I've said this before with structured programming. I think it's a real mistake, actually, to leave the more complicated aspects of programming until later. I know a lot of teachers disagree with that, but I can only speak about my own experience of 25 years in the classroom, having taught programming in lots of different ways. And I've realized that the way to ensure students understand things is to do a lot of repetition and to get it in the scheme earlier. So that's, yeah, absolutely. The sequence of learning, there's no mistake there. It's quite deliberate that we do lists at level 5, and then we do for loops in level 6, and we'll go on and talk about that in the next video. But it then gives a purpose to for loops, because for loops can be used as an iterator for the loop, which then differentiates them from a while loop, and we'll talk about that in the next episode. The other thing that that you mentioned there was Remind me, what was it?
Well, it was the whole array stroke list.
Yes.
Off arrays, and if whether you wanted to add anything brief on that.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, well, Python is a little bit odd, really, in terms of languages, I think, because everything is a list. That's actually not strictly true. Under the skin, at the architecture level, everything is actually an array. And when you add something to a list in Python, it actually recreates the structure elsewhere in memory, and it is actually an array. But it presents list methods and will behave like a list for you. What we do in the scheme is essentially we say that an array is a list with a defined number of elements or indexes. So if you define a list that has 10 elements, and you can initialize those with zeros or empty strings or whatever you decide, that's what we would then deem as an array, because it has a fixed size, and that differentiates it from a list, which can then grow and shrink as the program's running. You can add things to it and you can take things away. So although Python sort of breaks that, we think it's important to have that differentiation, because again, when you get to A level, you need to understand the difference between an array and a list. So if you always think that lists are all there is, I think that's a mistake. And if you think that Python only has lists, then I think perhaps that's a slight mistake. And so what we're doing all the time is laying the groundwork for the next level of study. So there we go.
Perfect. Oh, thank you for that, Dave. And yeah, thank you very much, Harry and Anna. So I usually at this point, don't I, put you on the spot and say what's the next level, but Dave gave it away. So we'll be back again next week to look at level 6. And as Dave mentioned, that's introducing count controlled iterations. Well, isn't that handy? Because we've just learned lists, and now we're going to learn how to loop through a list of things. It's almost like you lot got together and really thought about the sequence and the learning journey. So can't wait for that. So yes, anything else from you two, or are we happy to end there?
That's all from me.
That's all from me as well.
Oh, fantastic. And Dave's already said enough. Right, brilliant, everyone. We'll see you next week then when we look at Mission Encodeable level 6. Bye-bye for now.